November 9th, the biggest news of the 21st century. This single day changed the lives of Muslims all over the world forever. On one side was the world's biggest superpower, America, and on the other was a man named Osama bin Laden, a Saudi billionaire. He was the most wanted terrorist, responsible for orchestrating one of the deadliest attacks in history. This was not the first time someone had attempted to bring down America's Twin Towers. These skyscrapers were among the tallest and most famous buildings in the world at the time. In fact, nearly 500 Hollywood movies featured them in some capacity. Anyone who wanted to destroy these buildings knew that if the World Trade Center in New York collapsed, it would be the biggest news story of the modern era. To put it into perspective, imagine if someone brought down the Burj Khalifa today. Exactly 23 years ago, the world was different. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and China had not yet emerged as a global superpower. Back then, the United States was the world's only superpower, and no one could challenge its dominance. But on an ordinary day, September 11th, 2001, 19 men arrived at various airports, prepared to hijack 4 major American planes. According to US reports, all 19 hijackers were Muslims from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates. The hijackers were divided into teams of 5, each with a specific role. They had been training for months to carry out their mission. Once the 4 planes took off, the hijackers immediately put their plan into action. Just 15 minutes after takeoff, the first hijacker stood up, quickly seized control using small knives and box cutters, and killed both pilots. They then placed their own man, Mohammed Atta, in the pilot's seat. Atta forced the passengers to the back of the plane and announced that both pilots were dead, meaning only he could land the aircraft. This terrified the passengers into silence. However, the hijackers never intended to land the plane. As Atta was addressing the passengers, he accidentally pressed a button that connected him to New York's air traffic control tower. His words, "Sit down and stay calm. We are taking this plane to the airport," were heard by air traffic controllers, causing confusion. Believing the plane was preparing for an emergency landing, the airport quickly cleared a runway. A short time later, Atta again unintentionally connected with the control tower, further increasing their suspicions. This flight, originally scheduled from Boston to Los Angeles, suddenly veered 100 degrees toward New York. As it approached the city, the aircraft rapidly descended. Air traffic controllers, still expecting a landing, waited anxiously. But then, the plane vanished from radar. Moments later, reports surfaced. It had crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Initially, only air traffic officials knew what had happened, while the media remained unaware. News outlets began reporting it as a tragic accident. Meanwhile, President George W. Bush was visiting a school in Florida when his chief of staff whispered the news to him. His first reaction was that it must have been a terrible accident. However, just 15 minutes after the first plane was hijacked, a second plane was also taken over. The hijackers had carefully coordinated the timing, ensuring the entire world would witness the second crash live on television. The second plane was hijacked by Marwan al-Shehi, a 23-year-old from the UAE. He took control of the aircraft and turned it back toward New York. By now, news channels worldwide had interrupted their regular programming to cover the first crash, still calling it an accident. Then, in front of millions of viewers, the second plane came speeding toward the South Tower of the World Trade Center and crashed into it. At first, people were confused, but it quickly became clear. This wasn't an accident, it was an attack. President Bush's chief of staff again whispered to him, "Mr. President, America is under attack." The US military went on high alert, grounding all flights nationwide. But two hijacked planes were still in the air, and no one knew their targets. The third plane, piloted by Hani Hanjour, a Saudi national, didn't head toward New York. Instead, it turned toward Washington, D.C. As it neared the capital, the aircraft descended rapidly and accelerated toward one of the most important buildings in the world, the Pentagon, the headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense. The impact sent shockwaves across the globe. By now, the world was focused on both the Pentagon and the World Trade Center. But there was still one missing plane. When US intelligence tracked its direction, they saw it was also heading for Washington, possibly toward the US Capitol or the White House. With no time to spare, Vice President Dick Cheney ordered fighter jets to intercept and shoot it down if necessary, even if it meant killing passengers. 3 planes had already reached their targets, but the fourth, United Flight 93, piloted by Zia Jarrah, never made it. By the time Flight 93 was hijacked, news of the World Trade Center attacks had already spread. One passenger used an in-flight phone to call his wife, who informed him that the hijackers were lying. They weren't heading for an airport. This wasn't a hostage situation. It was a suicide mission. Realizing they were going to die anyway, the passengers decided to fight back before the hijackers could crash the plane into another building. Together, they stormed the cockpit. Seeing this, Jarrah violently shook the plane side to side to throw them off balance. But the passengers persisted, eventually reaching the cockpit door. Just as they were about to break in, Jarrah made a desperate move. He pushed the plane into a nosedive at full speed. The fourth and final plane was turned toward the ground and destroyed. News channels around the world immediately began covering the fourth plane again. Then, just an hour later, the South Tower of the World Trade Center in New York collapsed, killing 1,000 people. Shortly after that, the second tower also collapsed, resulting in another 1,600 deaths. In total, the 9/11 attacks killed 3,000 people, including 200 who jumped from the top floors of the burning World Trade Center buildings. A few days later, an interview surfaced with the father of Mohammed Atta, the leader of the attacks. He refused to believe his son was involved and blamed Israel's intelligence agency Mossad. He stated that Islam does not allow such acts. The families of the pilots of the third and fourth planes also rejected the American reports. Interestingly, the attackers were not from poor backgrounds. Most came from wealthy families. The 9/11 attacks were so massive that, even 100 days later, dust still covered New York City. The cleanup of the destroyed buildings cost billions of dollars. However, the collapse of the World Trade Center itself did not cause America its greatest financial loss. The real financial blow came from another building nearby that people often forget about, the New York Stock Exchange. After the attacks, panic spread through the US markets, causing the stock market to crash. Stock values dropped worldwide, with one of the biggest losses suffered by Warren Buffett's company, Berkshire Hathaway. It is estimated that the attacks cost the US $1.4 trillion, and the nation's GDP, which had been growing at 4 to 5% before 9/11, fell below 1% after the attacks. While most stocks plummeted, some companies saw massive profits, particularly those in the war industry, including weapons, fighter jet, and tank manufacturers. Investors rushed to put their money into these companies, knowing that America was about to launch a major war in retaliation for 9/11. The entire world turned its attention to President George W. Bush, waiting to see how the US would respond. A few days after the attacks, Bush addressed the world. He stated that no country or government was behind the attacks, but rather a terrorist organization, al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, who was hiding in Afghanistan. While the world blamed Osama bin Laden, he gave an interview to Al Jazeera, denying any involvement. However, his mixed statements left people unsure of whether he was truly responsible. Not only Osama, but also Muslim scholars and leaders worldwide condemned the attacks. Many pointed out that the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad strictly prohibited harming civilians, including women, children, the elderly, and even trees or farmers during war. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, and the Grand Mufti of Mecca both publicly stated that the attacks went against Islamic principles. Even Ayatollah Khamenei, a known adversary of the US, declared that 9/11 had nothing to do with Islam. Despite these statements, Islamophobia surged in Western countries. Muslim women wearing hijabs were attacked on the streets. Many Muslims lost their jobs, and some were even killed. For the first time, debates emerged on TV about whether Islam was a peaceful religion. Even as many Muslims distanced themselves from the attacks, the US placed full blame on Osama bin Laden and the Taliban government in Afghanistan. The US demanded that the Taliban hand over bin Laden and all al-Qaeda leaders. However, the Taliban refused, arguing that the US had no proof of bin Laden's involvement. The Taliban, led by Mullah Muhammad Omar, respected bin Laden for his role in Afghanistan's fight against the Soviet Union. They offered to try him themselves if the US could provide evidence, but America rejected the proposal. Instead, the US issued an ultimatum: hand over bin Laden or face military action. Confident in their military superiority, American generals expected the Taliban to fall within weeks. However, the Taliban, being Pashtun warriors, refused to comply, and the US began preparing for war. In a final attempt to avoid war, the Taliban suggested handing bin Laden over to a neutral third country, but the US, confident in its power, refused and launched an attack on Afghanistan just 1 month after 9/11. President Bush called the invasion a crusade and named it the War on Terror. The US sent troops from all directions into Afghanistan. The most powerful anti-Taliban force in Afghanistan was led by Ahmad Shah Massoud, whom the US fully supported. As expected, American forces swiftly took control, pushing the Taliban out. However, the US faced one major obstacle: the media, especially Al Jazeera. While most Western outlets like BBC and CNN focused only on the American perspective, Al Jazeera showed both sides. Their footage revealed that US airstrikes were killing not just Taliban fighters, but also civilians. The US military became furious, and just 4 weeks after the invasion, they bombed Al Jazeera's headquarters in Kabul. They also arrested and imprisoned an Al Jazeera cameraman at Guantanamo Bay, attempting to silence them. Within 3 months of the invasion, the Taliban government had collapsed. Without a leader for Afghanistan, the US organized a conference in Bonn, Germany, to select a new leader. They chose Hamid Karzai, a pro-American politician favored by the CIA. Despite US efforts to stabilize Afghanistan, Karzai's government was widely viewed as corrupt. The Afghan people never fully accepted him, and over time, the Taliban quietly regrouped. Meanwhile, In 2003, the US shifted its focus to a new war, Iraq. They falsely claimed that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, which even American officials later admitted was untrue. In 2004, just before the US elections, Osama bin Laden released a video taking full responsibility for 9/11. This helped strengthen Bush's political position, leading to his re-election. The war in Afghanistan, initially expected to last weeks, dragged on for over a decade. Even after Barack Obama became president, the war continued. In 2011, 10 years after September 11th, the US finally located and killed bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan. The US claimed to have buried bin Laden at sea to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine. However, many in Pakistan questioned the official narrative. Nevertheless, al-Qaeda later confirmed his death. After bin Laden's death, his surviving family members were imprisoned in Pakistan before being sent back to Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Although the US had achieved its goal of killing bin Laden, they remained in Afghanistan for another decade. This was partly to counter China's growing influence and to access Afghanistan's valuable mineral resources, including lithium. Despite 2 decades of war, the US failed to defeat the Taliban. In 2020, President Donald Trump struck a deal to withdraw American troops. Soon after, the Taliban quickly regained control of Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan is considered one of America's greatest failures. Despite 20 years of fighting, the Taliban emerged stronger than ever. Afghanistan once again earned its title as the graveyard of empires. Since September 11th, the war on terror has resulted in 4.6 million deaths and displaced millions more. That's all for today. We hope you enjoyed our video. We will continue bringing you more informative content in the future. Until then, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more exciting history lessons.